And welcome. I'd like especially to welcome our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Gary Anderson, who's Professor of Catholic Theology at Notre Dame University and, of course, ex-Harvard, having been here we discovered, for much longer than I have. So he will speak to us in a moment on the subject, I give, therefore I am, the meaning of charity in Jewish and Christian thought. So with our capital campaign about to start, this is a subject now dear to my own heart, and I hope everyone else's. So our speaker will be introduced by my colleague Andrew Teeter, Andy, who's Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible here at Harvard Divinity School, and I think a student of Gary Anderson. So Andrew Teeter began teaching at Harvard Divinity School in 2008, having completed his doctorate at the University of Notre Dame. His research centers on the modalities, techniques, aims, and motivations of early Jewish biblical interpretation, particularly as it intersects with the textual development of the Hebrew Scriptures. His teaching interests include a range of topics in the literature, history, and theology of the Hebrew Bible, with a focus on the history of interpretation, ancient and modern. Dr. Teeter is currently working on several projects relating to scribal hermeneutics, forms of interpretation, and models for transmission and translation of Scripture in Jewish antiquity. It's not easy for a historian to say this. Among these projects is a book on exegesis and the scribal transmission of biblical law in the Second Temple period, examining the degree to which early Jewish scribes deliberately altered scriptural texts for legal exegetical purposes. Lesser-known facts about him include his prowess on Vespas and skateboards, his sartorial embrace of the bow tie, which is clearly growing in this audience, and his superb teaching, which was recognized by our students and his much-deserved award as Teacher of the Year here at Harvard Divinity School. So Andy, please come and introduce our distinguished guest.
So I'm delighted to be able to introduce Gary Anderson, who, as was mentioned, is the Hesburgh Professor of Catholic Theology at the University of Notre Dame. To give a Harvard-centric narrative of his career, it all began in 1985 when he took his PhD from Harvard in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, followed by a position that he took at the University of Virginia. Then he returned here as a professor of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament at Harvard Divinity School for a decade or so, until about 2013, when he went to his current academic home, the University of Notre Dame. That year, 2003, as Providence would have it, coincided exactly with my first year of doctoral studies there, and this is, I think without a doubt, one of the best things that ever happened to me. His illustrious career has been marked by numerous awards and fellowships. He was Henry Luce Fellow, Fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Starr Fellow in Jewish Studies here at Harvard, I think 2007 or so. He was the Joint Strauss-Tikva Fellow at the Law School of NYU, and he is Fellow of the American Academy of Jewish Research, which is rather remarkable for a professor who holds an endowed chair in Catholic theology and is the current president of the Catholic Biblical Association. This remarkable fact says something about what is so remarkable and so respected about Professor Anderson's work. So I'll say more about that in a moment. So he's a prolific writer, both in the academic and the public spheres, having his contributions to scholarship having included important books on the ancient Israelite cult, on sacrifice and offerings in particular, on expressions of joy and grief in ancient Israelite religion, many works on the narrative of Adam and Eve and its rich and complex reception history within both Judaism and Christianity. 2009, he was the author of the acclaimed Sin, A History, published by Yale University Press. And last but not least, his most recent book, 2013's Charity, The Place of the Poor Within Biblical Tradition. His scholarship is marked by an immense breadth, obviously, and depth, and an extraordinary ability to combine philological and historical rigor with profundity of theological insight, and to bring all of these together with sort of a fruitful dialogue with the ongoing history of interpretation, both ancient and modern, both Jewish and Christian. These are qualities that I expect will be obvious to all of us in the presentation we're going to hear tonight, entitled, "I Give, Therefore I Am, the Meaning of Charity in Jewish and Christian Thought." So please join me in welcoming back Professor Gary Anderson.
Very much my pleasure to be here. I've spoken in this lecture room many times, but I have to say it looks much different. It's much classier than when I was here. I'm probably less classier, but the room is classier, so that's a good thing. Okay, let me begin. It would be difficult to overemphasize the importance of charitable deeds in the Jewish tradition. One only need turn to a Hebrew dictionary in order to learn that the biblical word for commandment, mitzvah, underwent an important change during the rabbinic period. It retained its base meaning of commandment, but developed the extended sense of almsgiving, reflecting the idea that almsgiving had become the commandment. And in fact, this Jewish notion, this what one might think actually is a rabbinic notion, that mitzvah would have this meaning, was quite broad in its reach. In both Ethiopic, Coptic, and in Greek texts, we have reflections of this Jewish tradition of the word for commandment, developing this secondary sense of almsgiving. The Talmud puts the matter quite succinctly. Giving alms is equal to keeping all the commandments in the Torah. The importance of charity is confirmed in the writings of the Roman Emperor Julian, sometimes known as the Apostate. Though he was raised in a Christian home, at the age of 6, he witnessed the brutal murder of his father and other family members. Forever turned off then to the claims of this religion that had only recently become licit, Julian embarked on a campaign to revive traditional Greco-Roman religion. In one of his letters, he exhorts a pagan high priest in what would be modern-day Turkey to provide food for the poor in order to combat the success of his Jewish and Christian competitors. But not only does he give this order, but as a sign of the seriousness of his intentions, he also provides the food that is to be distributed. He tells his priests that, quote, 1/5 of this is to be used for the poor who serve the priests, and the remainder be distributed by us to strangers and beggars. For it's disgraceful that when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans, his term for the Christians, support not only their own poor, but ours as well, all men see that our people lack aid from us. If we fast forward to our own day, we'll see that though we inhabit a much different world than that of Julian's, this particular feature of Judaism and Christianity remains visible for all those who would care to see. In their recent book, American Grace, Robert Putnam of Harvard and David Campbell, coincidentally of Notre Dame, demonstrate that religious affiliation is strongly correlated with charitable giving. With the aid of extensive surveys, they provide abundant evidence that religious people far exceed their secular counterparts in terms of both time and money dedicated to the service of others. Now, one might be tempted to cast a suspicious eye on these results and wonder whether routine synagogue or church activity accounts for the difference. But Putnam and Campbell have done their homework. Though it's true that religious people dedicate a lot of time and money to religious charities, they're also active participants in non-religious organizations as well. In fact, one of the surprising results, to me at least, of Putnam and Campbell's work is that they found that religious people are more involved in non-religious activities than even their secular counterparts. In some, religious people are more generous on every level than non-believers. Naturally, the question arises as to why this would be the case. And here I must concede, I'm not a social scientist, and I'm not going to pretend that I can make sense of the vast pool of data that Putnam and Campbell have assembled. I'm going to stick this afternoon to what I know best, which is the textual world of early Judaism and Christianity, and try to discern from these sources what are the grounds for their extraordinary interest in charity to the poor. Well, let me cut right to the chase on this matter, because the answer, I believe, really to this question is quite simple. For Jews, the act of providing for the poor is a form of avodah, that is, worship of God. And that's why, if we were to look at this text again of Julian, it's important to note that he orders his priests to do the distribution of goods to the poor. Why does he do this? Because he wants pagan lay people in the hinterland to associate the temple with these merciful bequests. Well, let's pause for a second on this point, because I think it's going to take a moment to sink in. For most religious persons, I would assume, charity to the poor is considered a natural outgrowth of their religious faith. Something like the correlation of good education and success in a career. What's primary, that is, service to the mind, has some beneficial but still secondary effects, that is, advancement in society. But this is precisely what I don't mean when I say that providing for the poor is a form of avodah, or worship. In early Jewish tradition, service to the poor becomes a privileged, and in some sense, in some circumstances, the privileged way to serve God. One can see this already in one of our earliest sources for the importance of almsgiving. That's the Jewish apocryphal book of Ben Sira. Ben Sira lived in the early 2nd century BCE in Jerusalem and exhorted his students to take their responsibilities to the altar in that city with utmost significance. Yet at the same time, he takes special care to correlate service to the altar with service to the poor. He writes, "The one who returns a kindness, gomer chesed, provides a grain offering, and the one who gives alms, otzei tzedakah, sacrifices a thank offering." The theology that is embedded in these brief lines is very well reflected in a painting from about 1400 by Andrea de Bartolo of Siena. The painting is now in display in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where I personally saw it a couple of winters ago. But the painting actually illustrates part of the problem that I want to address this evening. It was curiously mislabeled by the art historian who put it on the wall, Joachim and the Beggars. Now, in Christian tradition, Joachim is the father of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and he was considered to be a very pious Jew. And if one looks at this image, one can indeed see Joachim distributing bread to the poor. But a closer inspection of the image reveals that Joachim's wife, Anna, is standing immediately beside him and, not coincidentally, donating a jar of grain to the priests. In fact, the way in which they are depicted here, really joined at the hip, to use an English idiom, or an American vernacular idiom, I think nicely describes their appearance in this painting, and certainly must have been the interest of the painter as well, to render them almost as a single subject doing one thing, service to God, but in two modalities, a gift to the poor and a gift to the temple. In other words, exactly what we see here in Ben Sira. One can also find this in a late medieval depiction from the Liturgy of Hours. Here we have a standard correlation of the sacrifice of the Mass, which we see at the very top of this slide, and provision of alms to the poor in the bottom right-hand corner. In fact, these two images nicely illustrate a biblical proverb, tzedakah tatzil mimavet, generosity to the poor delivers one from death, because both of these actions were thought to retrieve the dead from purgatory. It's interesting to note, one of the things I didn't know when I began my research is how influential or cross-influential this image was in medieval Spain. There's a lot of literature on almsgiving in Jewish communities in Spain, especially bequests after death that employ the very same language Christians used, that is, hoping that the bequests after death would be used to assist the journey of the deceased to their restful place in the world to come. So this depiction, though, of very Catholic character actually had a very strong parallel within Judaism as well. And it also illustrates something that was very deeply embedded in my book. I'm not going to go into it this afternoon, but one of the challenges of working on these biblical texts is that they're deeply embedded in Reformation controversies. Of course, was quite aware that the sacrifice of the Mass was a hugely controversial concept in the 16th century in Europe, but almsgiving and charity to the poor was equally controverted. And when one begins to turn to New Testament texts that become the basis for almsgiving, or Old Testament in this case, if we're speaking in Christian discourse, texts that are going to be important for providing the prestige of almsgiving, they're all religious battlegrounds in the 16th century through the 20th century. In fact, you can see really the viciousness of the battle if you take a look at an off-cited book by Bornkamm on Der Lohngedanken in Neuen Testaments. It's really quite extraordinary as he goes to great efforts to try to show that the treasury of heaven really isn't a treasury in heaven. It's a hard thing to do, but he works very hard, and there's strong anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic commentary from beginning to end of that text. Not something you'll see so overtly, certainly in modern biblical work, but something that still, I think you can find, is part and parcel of the challenge of reading many of these texts, both in the Old and New Testament, to the very present day. These differences still cash out in how we read this material. Returning to this Ben Sira, though, and the images we've just looked at, it's hard for me not to link an image like this, or the one we were looking at from Andrea de Bartolo, to an off-cited homily of St. John Chrysostom, a well-known theologian and preacher who was active in the late 4th century and hailed from Antioch. He begins by acknowledging the honor that his congregation shows toward the altar in his church. The altar, he says, is worthy of such veneration, quote, because it receives Christ's body, end of quote, during the sacrifice of the Mass. But this is not the only altar to be found in Antioch, Chrysostom continues. Whenever you see a poor man out on the streets of Antioch after Mass, Chrysostom urges, imagine that you behold an altar. Whenever you meet a beggar, don't insult him, but reverence him. And Chrysostom, I want to suggest here, is following a train of thought that we can take back to Ben Sira, Tobit, and many other materials from the Second Temple period. Well, let's pursue this a little deeper. In order to do that, we'll need to pause for a second on the concept of an altar and how it functions anthropomorphically in the temple. Though most of us have been raised as good Maimonideans to believe that God is beyond any sort of material need, the concept of a temple itself requires that we temporarily suspend those worries. The temple is the place where God dwells, and as such, he's provided with a throne for sitting, a lamp for seeing, and an altar where his food is prepared. The altar functions something like that tube in Star Trek, where one could be miraculously beamed up from one domain to the other. The altar, according to biblical thought, was the place where meat, grain, and oil were directly transported from earth to heaven. So what happens if we take this anthropomorphic image and carry it over to almsgiving? If the altar has the special capacity of being able to convey food to God, then the hand of the poor similarly must be able to transfer funds from earth to heaven. And in fact, Jewish beggars in the land of Israel in late antiquity used to address their potential patrons with the words zechibi, literally acquire a zechut, a merit, through me, or perhaps more paraphrastically, make a deposit to your heavenly treasury through my hand. In other words, it has this same conveyance function that the altar does, and becomes, certainly in the modern period, problematic as an idea, just as the altar remains a problematic conception as well, because of these the deep anthropomorphic connections that are made. But if we don't bear these in mind, both with the altar and the hand of the poor, this deep anthropomorphic sense that a contact point is made here between heaven and earth, we're going to miss quite a bit of what's going on in these texts. We're going to read that line from Chrysostom, for example, simply as homiletical filigree, which it's not. It's the truth. This is what he thinks. You really meet God when you go out in the street and help the poor, just as Jewish beggars addressing their patrons with the word zechibi make the same point. You actually are not engaged here, it's like I like to say simply, in a horizontal action of enacting social justice. That may be part of it, but equally important in this act, and certainly the reason why it becomes so prestigious in synagogue and church, is you're meeting God by assisting the poor in this fashion. Let's pause for a second on this notion of the heavenly bank. Here, of course, we're in a potential nest of all kinds of difficulties from the 16th century, which I'm not going to entertain this afternoon, but we'll simply proceed as the texts outline this image. From the bank, we would want to turn to the notion of a loan. As you may recall, the command to assist the poor in the Bible is frequently spoken of in terms of the need to lend to those in need. So, for example, in the Covenant Code, when, here I'm taking the standard Midrashic translation, in the biblical Hebrew it's im, it's perhaps best translated if, either way it doesn't matter. If or when you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, do not act toward them as a creditor, exact no interest. Ben Sira was well aware of this biblical commandment, but he also had a very deep appreciation for the risks that were involved with it. When considering the problem of those who became poor by dint of bad luck, he told his students to keep the commandment, or that they were obligated to keep the commandment, but to be wary when doing so. He writes, "Many will regard their loan," here he's speaking of those who fall temporarily in need, "as a windfall, and consequently cause trouble to those who help them. Though they speak deferentially when requesting the money, they become indignant when it's time to repay." And as a result, Ben Sira concludes, many refuse to lend, not because of meanness, but from fear of being defrauded. So the first 7 verses of chapter 29, an extremely important chapter for my own book, and from which I learned much from my graduate student and I think colleague for a while of Andy Teeter, Brad Gregory, who wrote a great book on Ben Sira 29. So the first 7 verses are very concerned with what we might want to say are the real day concerns and problems of helping those in need when you loan them money. Verses 8 to 13, though, where the rubber really hits the road, is where things get quite interesting. If these warnings that Ben Sira now has just alerted us to are true of borrowers even in the best circumstances, then one would expect Ben Sira to be even sterner when he addresses the problem of the truly down and out. I mean, how are they going to repay? But what we find, much to our surprise, is just the opposite takes place. He commends his students to disperse their funds without a moment's forethought. "Lose your silver for the sake of the poor," he exhorts, and, here's our one of our phrases, lay up your treasure in heaven, for there it will profit you more than gold. A puzzling piece of advice for one who is so sober-minded about the risks that attend a loan. From whence comes this confidence? Really, I suppose my talk this evening is attempting to ferret out just how can Ben Sira do this? How can we move from this very sober-minded economics department, business school concern about getting your money back when you loan it to someone in need, from his no worries at all when you approach the truly indignant, to lose your silver and be assured that you will acquire a better treasury that will profit you more than the gold you presently own. Well, the reason for Ben Sira's confidence, I'm going to again cut to the chase, I'll return to this in a moment, is when one is helping the truly indigent, one is not engaged in a horizontal transaction, but rather a vertical transaction. In fact, Ben Sira, we could say, is really an extended commentary on a verse from Proverbs, one of the most cited verses in patristic literature having to do with almsgiving. In fact, it's a verse that returns in the work of John Wesley. I don't know if the verse is continuously used from the 5th century to the 17th and 18th, or if he's learned this verse from his active reading of the Fathers himself. But the verse reads, Malvei Hashem chonen dal gimulo yeshalem lo. The one who is kind to the poor, chonen dal, it makes a loan to God, Malvei Hashem, and God will surely repay that loan, Gimulo Yishalem lo. That certainly informs Ben Sira, and it's really part of the covenant code too. What scholars have noticed about this that is quite interesting is that the covenant code basically operates as casuistic law and in the third person. It's only in these laws with respect to the poor that this convention is broken, and we turn to the second person and direct address from God himself, bespeaking that we're no longer simply in a judicial law court in which human beings are enacting justice according to their own better wishes and guidelines, but we're encountering God directly. So it points towards, I would like to suggest, the covenant code points towards this sacramental sensibility of charity that's going to become part and parcel of Second Temple Judaism and ultimately early Christianity. But we can see the element, this vertical dimension, the importance of the presence of God in the charitable actions in a rabbinic midrash. Was there a handout today? It doesn't matter if there wasn't. Okay, I had sent a handout, but it doesn't matter. It's not necessary. This was one of the texts, though, was going to be on the handout, and I was going to say, if you forget everything else, remember this text. But you'll just have to remember it ba'al peh. I'm sorry? I will have it on the screen. I'll have part of it on the screen. Okay. So, in this particular tradition, Rabbi Gamaliel is approached by a Roman citizen and questioned about the rationality of his holy book. Can it be true, this Gentile asks, that your God, here he's probably thinking of Deuteronomy 15, commands you to give to the poor without a moment's hesitation? Someone who conducted his affairs in this fashion, this Roman citizen wonders, would be out of money within days, in need of assistance himself. To which Rabbi Gamaliel then responds, what if a man appeared out of nowhere and asked you for money? Would you give it to him? The Roman says, no, of course not. Rabban Gamliel continues, well, what if he brought you a deposit, a large deposit as collateral on that loan? And the Roman citizen replied, of course, that would eliminate all risk. Okay then, let's take it to another level. What if this potential borrower brought you a commoner to co-sign? He replied, well, I wouldn't issue the loan. I'm going to take a little bit of liberty with this text. He says, well, what if the president of Harvard University co-signed? Usually when I talk at other universities, it's the football coach. That's the go-to example, because that's the guy that makes all the money. I didn't think that would really translate well at Harvard, so I thought that the president of Harvard University would perhaps be better. But of course, the individual then would issue the loan by all means, because there are sufficient resources to guarantee repayment in the end. And then here's the key line. Well then, isn't the scriptural commandment altogether logical? If you'll issue the loan when the president of Harvard co-signs, how much more willing should you be when, quote, he who spoke and made the world, end of quote, agrees to co-sign? For Scripture says, he who is generous to the poor makes a loan to God, and God shall surely repay what he owes. So I can't underscore enough how we find this several times in rabbinic literature, but this is just plastered all over the patristic corpus. This is the go-to verse that demonstrates why charitable activity is so important. It would be difficult, as I've just said, to exaggerate how important this verse was in early Christianity. In the handout that I thought I would give, I provided some examples, but let me give just a few samples that indicate how important this was both in Jewish, Christian, and even Islamic thought. Well, I've done Judaism, and so I won't continue there. There are more texts I could bring to bear, but I think this one is enough. Saint Ephraim, a Christian living in eastern Syria whose native language was Aramaic, similar to the rabbis of Babylon, writes this: there are two heroic commandments, to love one's neighbor and God. You, here he's talking about a holy man, bore them like a yoke. Between man and God you sowed a beautiful deposit. You listened in order to act. You acted in order to issue a loan. You issued the loan in order to believe. We're going to return to that. That's a very important clause. You issued the loan in order to believe. And you believed so as to receive, and received so as to reign. Your alms and prayers are like loans. In every location they enrich those who take them, while to you belongs capital and interest. That alludes to ideas in Mishnah Peah that many of you may know. Not that he's citing Mishnah Peah, but it's the same world out of which both originate. What you offer as a loan returns to you. The alms of the giver are like the loan that the just give, for it is in full possession of both the borrower and the loaner, for it returns to him with interest. And then one last text from the Quran. In the past, God made a covenant with the children of Israel and appointed 12 chieftains among them. God said, I am with you if you establish regular prayers, give zakat, the term in Arabic for alms, but as most philologians will concede, it's a loan either from Hebrew or Aramaic. The spelling in Arabic is quite unusual. It's spelled really zachut, but vocalized zakat. And zachut, of course, is the term for alms or merit in Hebrew, and zakuta in Aramaic. So give zakat, believe in my messengers, honor and assist them, and make a beautiful loan to God. Okay, this understanding, this evidence for understanding charity in financial terms is quite impressive in terms of its religious breadth, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic sources, and chronological depth. What we've seen here in the few sources I've shown you stretch from the 2nd century BCE to the 7th CE. And the reason for the choice of this particular metaphor is grounded in the fact that charity is considered a form of avodah, or serving God. So much for the first 2 points I wanted to say this evening. That is, charity is a form of direct service of God, and it's a service that funds a treasury in heaven. But now for the question I'm sure that weighs heavily on the minds of some. I noticed that I spelled some here, S-U-M. I guess I was in the arithmetic mode. It's what philologians would call a phonetic spelling. Luckily, no students will study my manuscript. Is this metaphor of funding a treasury in heaven worthy of our admiration. That's the third point for this evening. When I've shopped this idea around to various focus groups, I've found that the reaction is not altogether positive. I love the idea, but my audience frequently is not so enamored. My friends and wife tell me that's often the case. It's the same with my jokes. For some reason, I'm the only one laughing. In any event, many are troubled by the idea that charity to the poor seems to be motivated in this mode of thinking by blatant self-interest. More than one person has wondered whether these texts do not lead inexorably to the rhetoric of the so-called prosperity gospel, which preys on the gullible by claiming that tithing will allow one to buy a BMW and pay off your mortgage all at the same time. Most people, I have found, are far more comfortable with the wisdom of Antigonus of Soko, who said, quote, "Be not like servants who serve their master on condition of receiving a gift," end of quote. And the literature, secondary literature on the materials that I have been speaking to this evening is almost uniformly critical. No one is really interested, I think, except for me, in recovering this material for contemporary thinking about what charity is. But let me caution, or offer a word of caution before despairing of the tradition that I have laid out. The first thing that needs to be borne in mind is that these financial metaphors come from wisdom literature, and a couple of them from the book of Proverbs. And Proverbs should be emphasized vary considerably in meaning depending on the context in which they are applied. It's always important to know the context out of which a proverb emerges. Let's consider, for example, one of the most important proverbs for the study of charity, that of Proverbs 10:2, which I'm going to paraphrase as follows, because this is how it's read in the Second Temple period, and I can't give this talk tonight, but I would suggest it's much closer to the simple sense of the biblical original than many scholars have given credit. But this is certainly how it's read in Tobit and Ben Sira, and then in evolving synagogal and churchly readings. Material treasuries, however great they might be, provide no benefit, but treasuries funded by charity deliver from death. The question that stands behind this proverb is how we should save for the future. A universal human concern if there ever was one. So let me suggest that you imagine that by some happy accident, you have become heir to an enormous sum of money. Rather than giving in to the urge to spend it immediately, you ponder how these funds might be invested to provide an endowment for the future. In front of you are two advisors, Warren Buffett, the famous investment guru from Omaha, and the Baal Shem Tov, known as the Besht, an 18th century charismatic tzaddik who was famous for emptying his pockets at the end of every day for the poor so that he could wake up the next morning wholly dependent on God. Mr. Buffett speaks of the prospect of a slow but inexorable set of gains over time that would guarantee a safe and secure retirement no matter how long you lived. The Baal Shem Tov, on the other hand, argues that God created the world out of charity, and as a result, your prosperity in the future would depend on finding a way to ride the wave of those currents. Though it's technically correct that the Baal Shem Tov would build on your natural tendency for self-preservation, I think we all must agree that the act of funding a treasury in heaven, considered in this way, is hardly to be imagined as a self-interested act in the simple sense of the term. Loaning to God in this fashion might be better conceived of as a means for the religious believer to put his money where his mouth is. I'd like to suggest that this way of reading Proverbs 10 and the wisdom material we've looked at provides us with a deeper set of insights than that of Antigonus of Soko. For however salutary it may be to serve a master without thought of a reward, most of us, I think, would want to know what kind of master are we called to serve that would merit such dedication. There is, I would want to contend, and this is really the thesis or one of the sub-theses of my book, there's a deeper human desire to know and believe that the world is a place formed and guided by charity, that giving to one's neighbor is not just a Kantian duty, but a declaration about the metaphysical structure of the world itself. Charity, then, is not just a good deed, but a declaration of belief about the world and the God who created it. Well, let me just read those two sentences again, because they constitute my third point for the evening and where we'll go from here. There's a deeper human desire to know and believe that the world is a place formed and guided by charity. That charity to our neighbor is not just a Kantian duty, but rather charity gives expression to a metaphysical construal of the shape of the world itself. It's a declaration of belief about the world and the God who made it. So that's my third point, and now you have it all. Charity is avodah, direct service, worship of God. It's realized concretely in the mode of making a loan to God, and in doing so, the charitable person is making a declaration about the nature of the world God has made, because they're saying that their safety in the future is not going to be guaranteed by hoarding material goods, but rather imitating the charity of the creator of the world in the first place. So let me say a little bit more on this point. We've seen that a gift to the poor is imagined as a loan to God. In conventional economic circumstances, making a loan involves risk. The housing, I was writing all of these sentences that we were in the midst of one of the greatest credit crises the Western world has known. And the irony certainly didn't escape me. And as I read the business pages, it was amazing to me how much they resonated with all the theological issues I was exploring. When my wife and I, in fact, during this time, were refinancing our home, our lender gathered all kinds of information about our financial holdings, the status of my employment, the valuation of our home, and even the nature of the neighborhood in which we lived. The reason for doing this was to assess the risk the bank was going to take. For when they offered us a loan, they not only express faith in us and our property, but they act on that faith. Or stated somewhat differently, by making a loan, they're making a statement about the neighborhood we live in and the type of people we are. It's not by accident that these people are called creditors, right? From the Latin credere, to believe. Think of the cognates, creed, creedal, credible, incredible, credulous, and so forth. Creditors are fittingly called believers because they, quote, put their money where their mouth is. It's never enough for a banker just to say he believes. The customer wants to know whether that belief has teeth. It can't be belief without works, to quote James. Faith without works is dead. The banker just can't believe. He has to enact that belief in the process of giving the loan. And so also for charity to the poor. Why is it, one might ask, that the life of Mother Teresa has moved so many people? And not just Christians, but Muslims, Hindus, Jews, and even non-believers. I would suggest that her popularity rests in the fact that she enacted a sort of faith that most of us can only dream of. But I would also want to contend that it was not just admiration for her faith that attracts our attention, but the statement that her enacted belief makes about the nature of the world. Though all appearances would suggest that it's Wall Street that makes the world go round, saints like Mother Teresa or the Baal Shem Tov make a powerful counterclaim. In serving the poor, they not only provide concrete material help to the down and out, but they reveal to us something about the hidden structure of the universe. Steven Pinker, usually I have to introduce him, I'm assuming I don't have to introduce him here in this august institution, once expressed dismay that the world showers such esteem on Mother Teresa in light of the far greater good that Bill and Melinda Gates have done. Gates, Pinker writes, quote, and I have the text at the very bottom of the slide, crunched the numbers and determined that he could alleviate the most misery by fighting everyday scourges in the developing world like malaria, diarrhea, and parasites. End of quote. Now, Pinker never explains how he knows that the Gates established their foundation on such utilitarian considerations. Perhaps the Gates' motivations were quite different. Melinda Gates professes to be a good Roman Catholic, raised and schooled in a Roman Catholic tradition. Perhaps her motivations are quite different. I'm not going to enter this afternoon into the motivations of the Gates. That's not my concern. My concern is rather Pinker's construal of what the Gates are about. Let me begin by suggesting that utilitarian value, that is what Pinker is interested in, is not the only index for measuring the accomplishments of charity. For however much the Gates might give away, and let's say they end up giving away $25 billion, that might even be too low an estimate, their daily life remains, by and large, unaffected. They're still one of the wealthiest couples in all of America. Mother Teresa, on the other hand, gave up everything she had to serve the poorest of the poor. Or think of the Baal Shem Tov emptying his pockets at the end of every day to the poor so he could wake up the next morning totally dependent on God. This total and unreserved trust, to quote Rabbi Gamaliel, has been put in, quote, he who spoke and the world was created. A truly impressive enactment of religious belief if there ever was one. Pinker wisely concedes that it's unlikely that his praise for the Gates will win him more admirers than those who admire Mother Teresa. But this, he claims, is, quote, because our heads can be turned by an aura of sanctity, distracting us from a more objective, scientific, reckoning of the actions that make people suffer or flourish. Mother Teresa, he asserts, quote, was the very embodiment of saintliness, white-clad, sad-eyed, ascetic, and often photographed with the wretched of the earth, as though this was simply a photo op for Mother Teresa. But this, I would want to suggest, is an amazing reduction of the gift she gave the world. When she started her religious order, the entire premise of the organization was the gift of one's total self to the poor. One well-educated Indian professor of the sciences, when asked about her admiration for Mother Teresa, said, I'm an unbeliever, but I feel I need an anchor, and Mother Teresa is an anchor. But let me reiterate here, I'm not belittling by any means the accomplishments of the Gates Foundation. It's truly extraordinary and worthy of the admiration of us all, and certainly myself. What I have tried to do in the last minute or so is explain why an Indian professor of the sciences, an unbeliever like Pinker, might find in Mother Teresa an anchor for her life. And what I've tried to suggest is that the affection for Mother Teresa can't be explained on the basis of simply a utilitarian calculation of the good accomplished by the actions at hand, the sort of explanation that Pinker prefers. Rather, the generosity of Mother Teresa, like the Baal Shem Tov, became praiseworthy because it was a statement about the nature of the world that God has created. Whether we're believers or unbelievers, I think it's fair to say that most of us want an account of human goodness that goes deeper than simply a utilitarian calculation. We want to believe that the world is good, and the world certainly, on the face of it, doesn't look such, and at least in the long run rewards a life of charity. The holy men and women of the synagogue, church, and mosque help us to do just that. And that's the deep reason I would like to suggest why the financial metaphor of funding a treasury in heaven becomes so significant in ancient Jewry and Christianity. The important point here is not what the giver is going to gain from the charitable act. One of the problems, I think, for modern readers of this material is they're so devoid of the theological sense that they only look at it from a horizontal perspective, and the only question that they can raise about the meaning of the action is on the horizon of altruism, which, again, is a good concern, and Jewish and Christian thought is concerned about altruism. But that's not the only measure of the charitable act I'm trying to suggest here this afternoon. When we look at the scriptural sources for this idea of a treasury in heaven, the way it functions is to say something about the character of the world God has created. That's what I want to suggest is operating in the materials invested in this idea. So let me conclude. We began with a quotation from Julian the Apostate regarding the striking fact that Jews and Christians were so generous to the poor. This led to our first question: what might explain their motivation? Our answer was simple. Service to the poor was service to God. The poor became walking altars wherein one could meet God. This led to a second question. But what precisely does this analogy mean? I suggested that just as the altar in front of the temple served to transfer food from earth to heaven, so the hand of the beggar with respect to coins. Jewish beggars, we observed, addressed their patrons with the words, "Make a deposit to your heavenly bank account through me." Then came the third and most important question. Is such a mercantile metaphor really appropriate to the religious life? I suggested that behind this metaphor resides the image of the debtor and creditor, something that goes all the way back to the covenant code in basic Jewish law, biblical law, about tending to the needs of the needy. When one gives to the poor, Ben Sira claimed, one becomes a creditor vis-a-vis God. And every creditor, I took pains to point out, is at base a believer. Loaning goods to the poor expresses a belief about God and the world that he's created. This is not a world that's governed by those who gather and hoard goods in hope of a better tomorrow, but by those who believe the future is best secured by sharing their goods with those in need. So that's the important theological dimension here, that you actually secure your future by giving away what you have. That's the counterintuitive claim of Proverbs 10:2. This is the reason I've suggested that figures like Mother Teresa or the Baal Shem Tov will always have more cachet as public icons than figures like Bill and Melinda Gates. And I confess again that I'm very humbled by the Gates' generosity and hope that in my own life I can match their generosity. But I'm not going to become, I know, a public icon for charity, and I'm trying to explain why Mother Teresa will always be more of an icon than Bill and Melinda Gates. Pinker thinks that the wider public has been duped by Mother Teresa's aura, as he puts it, of sanctity, and as a result has failed to make an objective reckoning, a utilitarian account of the accomplishments in question. But what I've tried to suggest this afternoon is that human beings want far more than a calculus of material accomplishment. We want a Weltanschauung, as our Indian professor of sciences remarked, that is a worldview that provides us with an anchor. Charity to the poor, I've tried to contend this afternoon, is that anchor. Thank you very much.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about this wonderful notion of the revelation of the structure of the universe. Could you map it for us? What kind of universe is revealed in the Jewish texts, the patristic commentaries, and Mother Teresa's witness? What is different about that universe and that revelation than as you said, a more simplistic economic kind of loan model with the heavenly treasury operating? What does it look like?
So I think maybe the point to be made here is it's a point actually made in slightly different words, but by Augustine in the Confessions, where at the end of the Confessions he's commenting on Genesis 1, and he gets to the end, and the completion of creation ends with the words that God found all that he had made very good. And Augustine asked himself, well, if I open up the door and look out on the streets of North Africa, can I say that myself? Manichaeans certainly didn't say that. I think it was as difficult to say that then as it is now. It's not obvious when anyone goes out on the streets of Cambridge, Boston, or outside my own home in South Bend that the world is by its nature good. But what Augustine in his commenting on that text said the only way we can read this text and believe it is come to see the world the way God sees the world. We have to see the world through God's eyes. And I think that's why Proverbs 10:2 is so important. I think the same thing is true in terms of thinking of our future. All of us, I think, are inclined towards the sin of avarice or hoarding, with the idea that somehow money or possessions constitute, in the end, what will really take us through hard times. And that's, here I learned something very important from my former colleague, Professor Levinson, when this proverb says, tzedakah tatzil mimavet, it's not, it's understood certainly in the images I showed here of delivering us from eternal death, purgatory, damnation, what have you. But in the context of the proverb itself, it means from the trepidations that may, lurk in our immediate future, right? And so there's a closely related proverb in chapter 11, where instead of death, it's biyom evra, and a day of wrath, and what the Greeks or Romans would have called tike or fortuna, the Lady Fortune will deal unhappy circumstances. How are you going to be prepared? The reflexive, I think, answer almost every human being would give is you want to save. You want that rainy day fund, that well-stocked IRA or what have you, with the notion that somehow those material sources are what will preserve you in the end. And what Proverbs wants to say is, no, if you're going to enter into the worldview that's being created here, the way in which you're going to secure your future is through charity towards those in need. That's the world that God has created, and that's the world and the type of activity that God will reward. And so when you act that way, you're swimming with the current of creation, right? And you are, I think that's one of the reasons the saints who, Baal Shem Tov, Mother Teresa, or whomever are like, because they live a life that exudes a faith that is actually the way the world's made, in spite of what we might want to think. And I think most people, believers or non-believers, want to think that the world is that way, that in the end, yes, charity is rewarded because the world is good. It's not simply a cold, indifferent place, right? The world that, Peter Singer imagines. There are some people that can be charitable in a world that Peter Singer can imagine, but I think most people would prefer to a world in which it's not indifferent to the task of being human, to the task of love and concern for those who have less. And the reward imagery that's so pronounced in all of this material, what I've tried to suggest is not principally about motivation, though there's an element of that, but it's more about what is the structure of the universe that God has made. I don't know if I can say it any clearer than that. I hope that's clear.
Thank you. So just to follow up, the idea is that in your reading of these texts over a long period of time, that you feel that the emphasis has been misplaced, that it's not that there isn't a kind of self-interest or a notion of a reward, but rather we need to read this more as a kind of moral cartography of how
moral
God
or maybe
functions.
metaphysical cartography. And I think the problem has been that most people, so the gradient of altruism is there all the way through in Jewish and Christian sources. So I'm not denying that is a concern. And you can look at Maimonides' scale of acts of charity and how they're going to be graded.
Right.
But what I've tried to suggest is that's not the only lens, right, to look at this material. And if that's the only lens we have when we come to the treasury in heaven, we just like, oh my God, you know what? You know, when I first started working on this, I actually gave a talk here at Harvard back when I was a Star Fellow. And a priest came up to me afterwards and he said, you know, after every homily I give on the rich young man, people ask me, he says, well, you know, Jesus says, you know, give money to the poor and you'll have treasure in heaven, come follow me. They always ask me, why does he say give treasure, you'll get treasure in heaven? That ruins the whole story, you know. It's like the whole story falls. And in a sense, I guess what I've tried to say in my book and today is to provide the answer for that, why the treasury in heaven is there, because that's the structure of the world. In fact, and that's a very good example because at least in Mark's gospel, the treasury in heaven is embedded in the travel narrative. And the travel narrative is invested in the notion that Jesus is going to die in order to bring in his kingdom. And he's going to say in Mark 8 that you have to, you know, to save your life, you have to lose it, right? And so for the rich young man, this is we want to say in Christian theological discourse, this is a cruciform activity, right? To become rich, you have to become poor, right? Philippians 2, you have to give away to acquire. And that I think that the gospel writer has that very much in mind. So I guess if I could go back and answer this fellow's question on the basis of what I've learned, I always, you know, learn the answer to the question several years later. But I guess you'd want to say, well, how about this? What if Jesus said, lose your life and just lose it, right? I'm just going to die on a cross and that's it. I mean, that'd be altruistic, right? No reward. But that's ridiculous. Because the whole point of, you know, lose your life to gain it, die on a cross to bring in your kingdom, is you're trying to say something about the way in which grace operates in the world, right? And I think that's the imagery also of the treasury in heaven, right? And I love that, you know, Proverbs 19:17 and Midrash Tanaim. That's the same thing. Raman Gamliel says, you know, this isn't crazy. You know, if you're going to, you know, accept surety from, you know, the head football coach at the University of Notre Dame, what if God's going to stand surety for you? And that's where all the imagery of belief, creditor, you know, stuff, you know, really comes home to roost. I tried to suggest in my sin book that it would be perhaps a front for, pursuing greater ecumenical cooperation between Catholics and especially Lutherans, because here you can see that any phenomenological attempt to divide faith and works here simply is impossible, right? They're both they're tied together in an inextricable fashion, right? You can't have, your banker can't be a creditor if he's not going to actually, you know, hand over the goods. Right. And I can't be a believer, right, in the same sense if I'm not also delivering the goods. Because both actions are, the creditor image is important. My banker is saying something, my neighborhood is actually, you know, a somewhat of a dicey neighborhood. I live right, you know, on a divide. And so when the bank gave me the money, they're saying something about where they think the neighborhood's going. You know, it's not just Gary Anderson's a nice guy or Notre Dame pays him a lot of money, but they're saying, not as much as the football coach, unfortunately, but they're saying something about where I live, who I am, and that's the same thing that's happening in charity, right? We're saying something about the nature of the world. That is the discourse, I think, that's been lost in, you know, there's a lot, I mean, this is a huge topic in late antique studies. I mean, it's all over the literature on charity is huge. But the literature that takes, in my opinion, the kind of theological dimension seriously is about this deep. Right. Because everyone, you know, it's the gradient of altruism. It's all what I would say, you know, horizontal, you know, socio-historical, little interest in, well, what if God is really a player here? You know, what does it look like if God's a player? I think it looks completely different.
Right. Thank you. Wonderful answer. Thank you.
Gary, could we see the painting again of Joachim?
Yep.
Okay, so now who are all these characters starting from the left? So you think it's Joachim is in the purple. Okay.
This is Joachim and this is Anna.
right?
He's handing bread to the beggars, and she's handing the grain to the priest.
And what is the priest doing? So who are those more beggars in the middle?
That's a good question. You know, that's one of the worries about showing an image is if someone is going to ask you a question about other figures that you don't know. Very well could be, but generally, if we take a look, generally beggars are depicted, you know, I think this fellow, I believe, has a stick leg, well, he's clearly bent over.
Right.
These people look too, I mean, I'm not an art historian, but I have looked at this.
They're too
They
healthy.
look too healthy. They look too healthy. That's not normally the way in which beggars are going to be depicted.
So I thought that she was giving a donation to the priest, and he
Yes.
in turn was giving the donation to the beggars. You know,
I see what you're saying. Well, you know, I suppose that's not impossible, but either way it works. Priest and people.
and who's on the right? Do we know that?
Don't know that either.
Okay.
They look young as though they might be children.
Yes.
They do look young. They could be orphans. That's possible.
Right. They're not.
Not impossible. One of the things that's interesting, and also one of the challenge, maybe it'll come up in a question here, I don't know or not. I mean, when we think of charity in the modern period, charity, of course, comes under heavy fire because it's contrasted with public programs of social justice, for example. Nick Waltersdorf has written quite critically on charity as opposed to justice. Many people have. In the 20th, 21st centuries, I can see how that criticism can be advanced. But so this is 1400. That is the early 15th century. Charity until the early modern period was organized. I mean, as Paul Vane in his book Bread and Circuses shows, it's not by accident that words for hospital, orphanage, poorhouse are all neologisms in Greek and Latin. The pagans didn't have terms for these because they didn't have these, right? They come, wherever the church goes, these institutions go. And he has a very interesting image, and this man is no friend of the church, so it's amazing that he says this. But he has this image in his book where he says, imagine yourself in a plane flying over a Roman city. If you look down below, you're going to see that the major buildings of the city are going to be the Colosseum, the baths, the basilicas, so on and so forth. What ergotism funds, right? You fly over a medieval, city, and you're going to see the church, the cloisters, the poorhouse, and the hospital. And the church, the delivery of goods to the poor was done both by lay people and religious. So it wouldn't at all surprise me that he would have the priest here actually donating to the poor, because that's what happens. But so did it happen with lay people too, lay confraternities. A great book on all of this that was recommended to me by a Reformation historian I'm good friends with was Sacred Charity by Maureen Flynn about lay confraternities in Spain from 1400 to 1700. But it's really quite amazing how organized it's the public works. And it was in Judaism as well in the medieval period, these lay confraternities. So again, it's when we think of charity in the 20th and 21st century, it comes under heavy fire, so maybe sometimes appropriately so. But we shouldn't carry our understandings of how charity works in a largely secular Western world back into the world of Jews and Christians in late antiquity and the medieval period. So that wasn't your question, but I gave the answer anyways.
Nice answer anyway.
All right. There's a lot of work, as you probably know, Shia, on comparing Jewish charitable practices in the Middle Ages to Christian. It's a cottage industry. And lots of interesting things are happening. This one Israeli scholar who I learned much from, Yehuda Galinsky, has written really an amazing article about charitable bequests in Spain in the late Middle Ages and the extensive borrowing between Jews and Catholics precisely on the issue of wanting to save the deceased, to assist their deceased to their final resting home. It's incredible, really. Yes.
I was going to, kind of continuing from the thought from a minute ago, I was going to ask how you see this sort of individual tradition you've been talking about the individual donation interacting with traditions of like the Sabbath year or the Jubilee year, or just more generally care of widows and orphans and those sort of more societal practices. And does that come out of the same kind of cosmology, or are they different?
No, that's a great question. I mean, all I can say is that I don't think I can say too much more than what I just said. That when we get to that point in time in which, well, Christianity is a licit religion and it actually can, engage in these public works, which is the 4th century, it's active in doing this on every front. Now, it probably precedes that. The problem in the book I wrote on this subject and in the materials that interest me, the wisdom materials, the genre is oriented towards the individual, right? As is, much of the preaching in the Gospels. But I don't think we should take. We should be careful to realize that's a limitation of the genre. It's paranetic literature trying to encourage individuals to make a proper choice, right? But I think what happens sometimes in audiences is people see that the literature is addressed to the individual and they attach that to the modern condition of charity in our world simply being for example, I don't want a social safety net for the poor. I'm just going to drop a couple dollars in a beggar's, cup on my way to the Red Line in Harvard Square, right? That would be the worry people, a legitimate worry people would have, but that's not fair to the material of antiquity and certainly the Middle Ages, because in these materials, it's deeply organizational and has an infrastructure. It already does in the Mishnah and Talmuds with soup kitchens. I mean, it's highly organized. Now that and you look at the Mishnah tractate Peah, which is not an accident. It's titled that. It comes out of the biblical legislation for how to treat the poor. The Jubilee year, of course, does not continue. You need a government in power to be able to. Well, anyways, the Jubilee year is problematic on many grounds, but. The notion of wanting to enact these things institutionally is deep in both Judaism and Christianity. But the concern of me, I'm not a late antique historian nor a medievalist. I'm interested in Second Temple Judaism, and the genre of the literature doesn't give expression to those concerns.
Thank you very much for a very fine lecture. I just want to propose what I think might be a friendly amendment to your thoughts about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Mother Teresa. It seems to me that the people who are in the nonprofit sector, those of us in the nonprofit sector, tend to think instinctively of ourselves as living a more moral and generous altruistic life than people in the profit sector. On the other hand, without profit, if all we had was a subsistence economy, there would be no surplus, and Mother Teresa would have nothing to give away. In other words, were there not Bill and Melinda Gates types with Microsoft making a profit, there would be no possibility of Mother Teresa making her donations and engaging in the altruism. So my question is, isn't the actual relationship between these things obviously much more sophisticated than Pinker implies? But isn't it also the case that the ethic of charity requires an economic incentives towards productivity and wealth creation in the first place?
Oh, I would definitely agree with that. I guess I perhaps didn't qualify myself enough with the Pinker Mother Teresa comparison. I guess what was at stake for me in that particular issue was I was not trying to say anything against Bill and Melinda Gates, nor with respect to the profits they made, but rather simply addressing what I think is a simple fact on the ground that, if 200 years from now, people are not going to remember Bill and Melinda Gates, but they're going to remember Mother Teresa. That's basically how the lives of the saints work. And more people, I think, know her or certainly people, that's Pinker's, why he's exasperated, is that they honor her more than him. So that I guess the question for me is why would that be the case? There certainly is a place for considering utilitarian value in what one does with one's charitable goods. I certainly do that and try to extend the value of every dollar I distribute. But I think we also, as religious people, want to know in the end that charitable giving isn't simply about making the world better, but that it's also an expression of what we think, what type of world it is we live in, and what type of God created a world like that, if you see what I mean. And that was the only point I was trying to make. And so Mother Teresa's, not everyone can do what Mother Teresa does, nor in the Catholic tradition is everyone demanded to do such. But persons like her allow us to see what I tried to suggest, the type of world that God has made, that we participate in our own, and I'll speak just for myself, more limited, ways of giving.
Thank you, Gary, for a wonderful lecture, very provocative. And being the inveterate comparativist, I can't help but I was thinking about some of these issues about the treasure in heaven, emptying your pockets, having nothing to give the next day, the radical witness of Jesus on the cross and so on, through a Hindu and Buddhist lens. And on one level, there are all enormous number of parallels to what you're saying, as you might expect, in terms of just the transactions of giving and receiving, both with your family, the community, in the temple with the deity, and even the kind of the metaphysical frame of karma. Mm-hmm. What you do is what you get in this kind of invariable form. One element that's there that pauses me, makes me think here, is all of that makes sense in terms of being a giver and a receiver, but kind of a radical strand, you might say, of Upanishadic thought or Buddhist thought in India, is ceasing to be the kind of person who can give or receive, and sort of a radical kind of divestment of identity, so that you're no longer in the game of giving and receiving, but you're this kind of other kind of figure. So in Indian context, the solitary sage in the forest, the naked yogi, and so on, who really can no longer give or receive because they cease to be metaphysically that. And I'm wondering if that example, let's say, of Jesus on the cross, also has that element to it. So there's the wisdom element of transaction, and the other element of no longer being a person who gives and receives. Does that fit into your model, or is that something else?
Not really, because what Jesus generates on the cross, of course, is at least in classical Christian thought to be, an infinite amount of merits that then, humanity benefits from here to the end of time. And then the sacrifice of the Mass, at least in Catholic thought, is, the ongoing re-representation of that once and for all action, so that it is that notion of giving and receiving, but always conceived of as really God's giving, our receiving. We become givers only by dint of the grace that God gives us to allow us to participate in that, in what Christians would call the cruciform mystery. So I don't see how you would imagine someone as falling, evolving somehow in their religious life, that they go beyond that, because I think that's the heart of the, at least for a Christian, the Trinitarian mystery.
I think, we can talk about this later, but I think the model would be the idea that in ordinary life, we naturally think of giving, receiving, and God is the greatest of givers, and we are the ones who receive from God. But that model of anthropology, or that model of the human, isn't the only model. And this other self is the one to whom nothing can be given, from whom nothing can be received, is another kind of spiritual being. And I'm wondering if figures like Mother Teresa, as you point out very convincingly, in a sense are more persuasive, because she burnt her bridges behind her. She left the convent, she left the security, she lived on the street. Or Francis of Assisi, stripping naked, leaving everything behind. not necessarily at some gut level because I'll get treasures in heaven, but I'm no longer a transactor. Anyway.
Oh, well, then we're on to a different issue, but this, of course, is interesting, too. I mean, we talked about, well, there's a session on my book at the SBL, but there's a kind of paradox here. In other words, the saints of the church never describe themselves as in the process of acquiring treasuries. You won't find any of them doing that, but they're all understood by others to have done precisely that, right? If any of them even think of themselves as having any treasure to give, let's say Thérèse of Lisieux, she says in her writings she would be willing to descend into hell itself to let others out, right? In other words, her life is just continually that of giving. But the tradition has always understood them, the paradox of living a life of such giving. They're actually, receiving, an enormous amount. But it's an important point to make, because religious or theological principles, certainly in a Catholic, context, never simply are, isolated sentences on a page. They have to be interpreted in terms of the concrete life of the Christian vocation. Here are the lives of the saints, and that's how you, I think, read much of the merit language. And at the end of my book, I discuss Augustine's treatment of the death of his mother Monica, and he clearly begins with the meritorious actions that she committed during the course of his life, but he doesn't at any point in his writing about her say, God, you owe her, now raise her from the dead, right? Everything rests in God's mercy. But Augustine believed that, that people did merit as a result of good deeds, but he doesn't use that language in this context.
Gary, thanks a lot for your lecture. You mentioned John Wesley as someone who was, particularly influenced by this teaching, as indeed he was, and even though for many years he was interpreted as a kind of example of the Weberian ethic of Protestant discipline and acquisitiveness. That's not the tradition. He is deeply influenced by the materials that you mentioned. He does take it one step further, though, in terms of, he says not only, that we should give charitably, but says that if we retain, then we're responsible for all the suffering in the world that we could address but choose not to. In other words, we have the resources and choose not to do it. So do you see that in these materials? And where did he get that notion? Is that simply a deduction?
You can certainly find that in Basil and Chrysostom. That's there too. It's a form of stealing, they imagine. And I'll come at Professor Levinson's question in another direction, and yours as well. You won't see that concern, at least I'm not aware of it, in wisdom materials, but they come at a slightly different way. I like to think of the image of the ring in Lord of the Rings, or actually, I've thought of doing this in class. I won't do it here. It's too lowbrow for Harvard, but it'll work at Notre Dame. But the way money functions in my favorite TV show of all time, Breaking Bad. The point is this. So let's stay with Lord of the Rings. That'll probably be better image here. The ring represents power, right? And it has this force that can overcome even the most innocent, kindly disposed person, right? That just the notion of power is it's not just a ring, but it's like exuding something, that you can't extract yourself from. And that's how Ben Sira thinks of his wealth. Ben Sira is not against wealth. I mean, he would agree, I think, with many of the things Professor Levinson said about its importance and utility. But he also recognized that for the person who had money, this was an extraordinary temptation, right? Because you are going to be led to think that somehow this stands in for God, right? There's a great section in which, he says, who is the rich man who has survived, the test of their wealth? And the implied answer, I think it's chapter 11, is, no one. And he says in this text, like the rich fool. But then what happens in the rich fool? He says, now I'm set for life, right? He thinks that this stuff is going to do it. That's the problem. That's what Ben Sira would say. That's the problem, is once you've got it, then you think, I'm set. And that's the issue. That's what these sources are worried about. So it's not as much that, if I keep all this, someone else has less. I don't think you'll find that in Ben Sira, but you have a slightly different problem, is if I have all this money, I think I'm set from here to eternity. But that's foolishness. That's Proverbs 10:2. That's the Otzerot Resha. That, you are, that's actually often terribly translated. It's translated, I think, in light of, our more kind of soft Marxian concerns, an otsar, or a treasury that's acquired in a wicked way. But as I've argued, that's not how any of the sources understood it. What's Resha about it? It's that you think it can do something it can't do, right? The only thing that can really do something for you in your future is giving it away, sacrificing, right? That's the only thing in the end that's actually has purchase in the type of world God's made. And that's the concern of these writers.
I think our time is one more.
Maybe Louise over here. He's been waiting.
Well, thank you also for the lecture. I'm happy you didn't give too much spoilers before I read the book. But no, since you set up your talk and your book against contemporary scruples over the financial conception of charity as an economy of grace, I wonder if you also encounter pre-modern scruples over this idea in Jewish or Christian sources. One of the examples that comes to mind in late medieval Christian mystical theology, debates about perfect charity as completely divorced from expectations of merit. In Bernard of Clairvaux, you find in late medieval Franciscan theology, and in 16th century Spain, many of the participants in the debate over public charity also adduce, for example, the idea of caridad perfecta, the anonymous sonnet, no me mueve mi Dios para quererte, el cielo que me tienes prometido, ni me mueve el cielo tan premido para dejar por eso de ofenderte. It was a major subject in late medieval Spanish Christian theology, whether perfect charity entailed a complete disengagement from the expectation of reward or punishment based on merit.
Well, I'm not going to be able to speak about all these sources because I haven't read them all. I've followed the ones that are interested in the financial side. So what I would say is this, is the Proverbs 19:17 imagery is extraordinarily deeply embedded in patristic thought. And so by the time you get to, for example, Leo the Great, he doesn't even, I don't even know if he knows the proverb from which this comes from. His homilies are full of the notion of sacred usury, as he calls it, and exhorting his congregation to, you can't loan at interest, to the poor. Scripture forbids that, but loan at interest to God, right? That's what you ought to do. And Augustine likes it too. Augustine sometimes cites Proverbs 19, but not always. And then the poor are understood in Augustine as porters of goods from heaven to earth. And then what you get in in Maureen Flynn's book in Spain, slightly different than what you're speaking about, but for example, you were the one that first alerted me to this, the early form of the novel, which spoofs this, but in Spain, no one of any means would ever imagine having a funeral in which poor people were not invited. Because precisely the covenant code, God hears their prayers, right? So you've got to have them there. God's not going to hear your prayers. So you got to have the poor there so that God can hear. Now, and this also comes under huge heavy fire from modern, people that they're fetish-sized, they're just, instruments, blah, 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 which, it may be true. I'm not going to make a case here in the 30 seconds that remains to me for this, But I will say what it does is it makes the poor visible. And I've often thought, well, what would it look like in our day if state funerals in Washington, D.C., included people going into, the slums of D.C. to pull out poor people to pray in the National Cathedral? I mean, that would be quite a sight. But that was an everyday sight in the time period in which you work, right? And it has to do with the fact that these were they were living altars. It's also the reason why in Catholic countries it was very hard to outlaw beggars, right? It was like the Zechibi and in late Jewish Palestine. These were avenues to grace. How you get rid of them. This is how you approach the Godhead. It's not getting quite at your question, but I guess what I want to say is that because I'm not going to pretend to know the fathers on every side of this question, but this sacramental financial element is just a huge part of their vocabulary.